13-year-old Yara Gambirasio had her whole life ahead of her. She was a promising young gymnast, known for her dedication and bright spirit. But in 2010, everything changed. She left her gymnastics practice in Brembate di Sopra, a small town near Milan, but never made it home. For months, her disappearance baffled investigators and devastated her family. Then, 3 months later, a discovery in an open field turned their worst fears into reality. Yara was a kind, responsible girl. She took gymnastics seriously, training regularly while keeping up with school. Her parents described her as disciplined and mature for her age, always making sure to let them know where she was going. That's why, when she didn't return home after practice and wasn't answering her phone, her family knew something was terribly wrong. If you're new to the channel, welcome. As a police officer, I investigate some of the most brutal, complex, and seemingly impossible cases, uncovering the truth behind them. Make sure to subscribe and like the video so you never miss a story. Today's investigation takes us to Brembate di Sopra, a quiet town in northern Italy. This is one of the most complex cases in the country, even becoming the subject of a Netflix documentary. Her disappearance sparked a massive search. Hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement officers combed the area, hoping to find any sign of her. But the lack of security cameras at the gym made things difficult. No one knew exactly what happened after she left practice that evening. Some witnesses claimed to have seen her outside, but after that, she vanished without a trace. November 26, 2010, was supposed to be like any other evening for 13-year-old Yara Gambirasio. She had spent the afternoon doing what she loved, training at her local gymnastics center in Brembate di Sopra. Yara was known for her dedication to the sport, and that day was no different. After practice, she was supposed to return home, just a short walk away. But this time, she never arrived. Her last known movements were normal. Before leaving the gym, she briefly spoke with a friend, letting them know she was heading home. It wasn't unusual for her to walk alone. Brembate di Sopra was a peaceful community, and Yara had always been responsible about keeping in touch with her parents. But when she didn't come through the door at her usual time, her family immediately sensed something was wrong. At first, they tried calling her phone. No answer. Maybe she had stopped to chat with a friend. Maybe she was running late. But as the minutes turned into hours, their worry grew. Yara wasn't the type to disappear without letting them know where she was. By the time night fell, her parents had no doubt. Something was very wrong. Panic set in. The Gambirasio family contacted the Carabinieri, Italy's law enforcement agency, reporting their daughter missing. Given Yara's young age and her responsible nature, officers knew this was not a case of a teenager simply running away. They responded quickly, gathering as much information as possible from the family. Every detail mattered: what she was wearing, what time she left the gym, who last saw her, and whether she had mentioned any plans before disappearing. Realizing the urgency, law enforcement immediately dispatched officers to key locations. They searched the area surrounding the gym, checked common routes Yara might have taken home, and questioned anyone who may have seen her that evening. They also reached out to local hospitals in case she had been involved in an accident. Despite their efforts, there were no immediate signs of Yara. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. As the hours passed and no new leads emerged, the search efforts intensified. Authorities alerted nearby towns, expanded their patrols, and requested assistance from specialized search teams. Volunteers and law enforcement scoured the area. They checked the gym, the surrounding streets, and any possible routes Yara might have taken home. But a major setback slowed the investigation. Security cameras at the gym were either not working or didn't provide a clear view of what happened. There was no footage to confirm whether Yara had left alone or if someone had been waiting for her. With no security footage from the gym to track her last movements, investigators had to rely on witness statements and a growing sense of fear that something terrible had happened. The race to find Yara had begun, but no one could have imagined how long and complex the search for answers would become. As hours turned into days, the case gained national attention. News stations reported on the missing girl, and flyers with Yara's picture were plastered across town. Her family, devastated and desperate, pleaded for answers. But there were none. Weeks passed, then months. Hope faded. The community still searched, But there were no leads, no witnesses, no clues, nothing. Then, on February 26, 2011, exactly 3 months after Yara disappeared, everything changed. A man named Ilario Scotti was flying his remote-controlled plane over a field in Cignolo di Isola, about 10 kilometers from where Yara was last seen. As he walked through the tall grass to retrieve his plane, he noticed something unusual. At first, he thought it was a pile of discarded clothes. But as he stepped closer, he realized that, truth, it was the body of a young girl. He immediately called the police. Investigators arrived, and soon, the devastating confirmation came. After 3 long months, Yara Gambirasio had been found. The condition of her body told a tragic story. She had been left in the open field, exposed. The cold winter had slowed decomposition, but it was clear she had been there for a long time. Forensic experts noted she had multiple injuries, stab wounds, blunt force trauma, but there was no sign of sexual assault. The cause of death? Hypothermia. After suffering through a brutal attack, Yara had been left to die in the freezing cold, unable to call for help or protect herself from the harsh winter temperatures. Hypothermia occurs when the body loses heat faster than it can generate it, causing the core temperature to drop dangerously low. In cold environments, the human body works to conserve heat by redirecting blood flow away from the skin and extremities to protect vital organs. As body temperature continues to fall, the victim experiences confusion, exhaustion, and an inability to move properly. Eventually, the body shuts down, leading to unconsciousness and, if left untreated, death. For Yara, this process would have been slow and agonizing. Already weakened from her injuries, she likely struggled to stay conscious as the freezing air drained the last warmth from her body. Alone in the deserted field, with no one to rescue her, the cold claimed her life in the cruelest way imaginable. Her family was shattered. Though they had feared the worst, nothing could prepare them for the reality of losing their daughter in such a horrific way. The small town of Brembate di Sopra was overcome with grief and disbelief. Who would do this to an innocent 13-year-old girl? And why? The discovery of Yara's body was a turning point in the case, but it raised more questions than answers. Who had taken her that night? How did she end up in a field so far from home? And most importantly, who was responsible for her death? The search for her killer was just beginning. The discovery of Yara Gambirasio's body in February 2011 turned the search for a missing girl into a full-scale murder investigation. Law enforcement had spent 3 months searching for her, but now they had something even more critical: physical evidence. The question was, would it lead them to her killer? With Yara's body found in an open field in Cignolo di Isola, investigators immediately sealed off the area. They carefully examined the site, searching for any clue that could explain how she ended up there and who was responsible. But the field itself offered little information. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no weapon left behind, and no immediate traces of the person who had abandoned her there. An autopsy was conducted as soon as possible, but it presented challenges. Yara's body had been exposed to the winter cold for months, which made it difficult to determine exactly when and how she had died. However, forensic experts found several key details. She had been stabbed multiple times in the back and neck with a sharp instrument, possibly a knife. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. None of her wounds were immediately fatal. Instead, she had died from hypothermia, left alone in freezing temperatures after the attack. Despite initial suspicions, there were no signs of sexual assault. One of the most crucial findings was DNA evidence. On Yara's underwear, forensic experts detected trace amounts of DNA that did not belong to her. This discovery was a breakthrough. It meant that whoever had attacked her had left behind biological evidence. If police could identify the source of the DNA, they could find the killer. Investigators had only one piece of solid evidence: the unknown DNA sample. But matching it to someone in a country of millions would not be easy. Instead of waiting for a match to appear in a criminal database, police decided to take a more aggressive approach. They launched one of the largest DNA testing operations in history. Over the next 3 years, law enforcement collected DNA samples from more than 22,000 people. They focused on individuals in and around Brembate di Sopra, hoping the perpetrator lived nearby. The strategy was simple. If they couldn't find an exact match right away, they might find a partial match, a relative of the killer. And after years of testing, that's exactly what happened. In 2013, forensic experts finally found something promising, a partial DNA match. It wasn't an exact match to the unknown DNA on Yara's body, but it was close enough to indicate that the suspect was a close relative of the person who had provided the sample. The DNA was linked to a local man named Giuseppe Garanoni, a former bus driver. There was just one problem. Garanoni had died in 1999, years before Yara's murder. If Garanoni couldn't be the killer, then who was? Investigators now had to answer a different question. Did Garanoni have a son he didn't know about? To solve this mystery, police began digging into Garanoni's personal life. They interviewed former colleagues, friends, and acquaintances. One person described him as a ladies' man, known for having had multiple affairs throughout his life. With this information, investigators compiled a list of over 500 women who may have had a relationship with him. One by one, they collected DNA samples, hoping to find someone who had secretly given birth to his child. Finally, they found their answer. A woman named Esther Arzuffi provided a DNA sample, and it was a perfect maternal match to the unknown DNA found on Yara's body. This meant that the killer was Esther Arzuffi's son. She had 2 children, a twin brother and sister, but only one of them was male. His name was Massimo Bassetti. With this discovery, police had their prime suspect, but they needed to confirm their suspicions with an independent DNA sample from Bassetti himself. They couldn't simply ask him for one. It had to be collected without his knowledge. So, they set up a fake traffic stop, carefully planning it to seem like a normal roadside check. As Bassetti drove along an ordinary route, unaware that he was under surveillance, officers signaled for him to pull over. Keeping their approach casual, they informed him that they were conducting random breathalyzer tests as part of a standard traffic safety operation. Bassetti complied without hesitation, unaware that this was no ordinary stop. He followed instructions, placing his mouth on the breathalyzer and blowing into the device, thinking nothing of it. What he didn't realize was that, in that brief moment, he had just provided investigators with exactly what they needed, a fresh DNA sample. The officers remained professional, completing the test as if it were routine, then let him go on his way. Meanwhile, forensic experts were already preparing to analyze the saliva left behind, eager to confirm what they strongly suspected, that the DNA would be a perfect match to the sample found on Yara Gambirasio's clothing. When forensic experts tested the DNA, the results were undeniable. Bassetti's DNA was a perfect match to the sample found on Yara's underwear. The arrest of Massimo Bassetti on June 16, 2014, sent shockwaves across Italy. After years of searching for Yara Gambirasio's killer, law enforcement had finally found their suspect. The DNA evidence, according to investigators, was irrefutable. But as soon as Bassetti was taken into custody, he maintained his innocence. "I might be stupid, an idiot, ignorant, but I'm not a killer," he told the court. Despite his protests, prosecutors were confident. They believed they had enough evidence to convict him of kidnapping and murdering Yara Gambirasio. What followed was one of Italy's most closely watched legal battles, a case that would test the power of forensic science in the courtroom. After his arrest, Bassetti was formally charged with the murder of Yara Gambirasio. Prosecutors alleged that he had abducted the 13-year-old after she left gymnastics practice on November 26, 2010, attacked her, and then left her to die in a field in Cignolo di Isola. The case against him centered around forensic evidence. The most critical piece of evidence was the DNA found on Yara's underwear, which forensic scientists determined was a perfect match to Bassetti. The prosecution argued that there was no innocent explanation for why his genetic material would be found there. Additionally, fibers from his van's upholstery were discovered on Yara's clothes, suggesting that she had been inside his vehicle at some point. The trial began in 2015 in a court in Bergamo, drawing national attention. For Yara's family, this was a long-awaited moment. They wanted justice for their daughter. Bassetti, meanwhile, entered the courtroom appearing calm but determined. He remained consistent in his claims. He had never met Yara, had no idea how his DNA ended up on her clothing, and insisted he was being wrongly accused. The prosecution relied heavily on forensic science to argue their case. They presented Bassetti's DNA as indisputable proof that he was Yara's killer. They also highlighted suspicious online searches found on his computer, including disturbing content related to young girls, which they suggested hinted at a possible motive. Furthermore, Bassetti failed to provide a clear alibi for the night Yara disappeared. The prosecution insisted that the DNA evidence, combined with the fiber analysis and the defendant's lack of explanation, was enough to convict him beyond reasonable doubt. Bassetti's defense team, led by lawyers Claudio Salvagni and Paolo Camporini, fought aggressively to challenge the prosecution's claims. They argued that the DNA evidence was flawed and that the original samples had been mishandled or contaminated. They also pointed out that the mitochondrial DNA did not fully match Bassetti, raising doubts about the integrity of the forensic process. The defense further emphasized the absence of a clear motive. Unlike most murder cases, there was no evidence linking Bassetti to Yara before the crime. There were no witnesses who had ever seen them together, and Bassetti had no history of violence. To cast further doubt on the prosecution's case, the defense suggested alternative suspects. They pointed to a female employee at Yara's gym who had been seen crying on the night of Yara's disappearance and had deleted text messages afterward. However, no concrete evidence linked her to the crime. Bassetti himself pleaded with the court, insisting that he was innocent. He even suggested that his work tools, including a knife, had been stolen and could have been used by someone else to commit the crime. But despite these claims, the prosecution remained firm. The DNA evidence was the strongest proof, and Bassetti had no explanation for why it was found on Yara. On July 1, 2016, after a year-long trial, the court delivered its verdict. Massimo Bassetti was found guilty of the murder of Yara Gambirasio and sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom was filled with emotions as the judge read the sentence. Yara's parents expressed relief, stating that while nothing could bring their daughter back, justice had been served. Bassetti, on the other hand, was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he listened to the decision. He insisted that he was the victim of a wrongful conviction and vowed to continue fighting for his freedom. His defense team immediately filed an appeal, insisting that the DNA evidence should be re-examined to verify its accuracy. They argued that such a crucial piece of evidence should undergo further testing to eliminate any doubts about contamination or errors in the original analysis. However, in 2019, the court rejected their request, ruling that the original DNA samples were no longer available for re-evaluation. This decision dealt a significant blow to Bassetti's legal battle, as it meant that the very evidence used to convict him could never be independently verified again. With no way to challenge the DNA findings, Bassetti's legal options became increasingly limited. His appeals continued to be dismissed, reinforcing the court's stance that the conviction was based on solid forensic proof. As the years passed, he remained behind bars in Bolate prison, adjusting to life under maximum security. To pass the time and cope with his confinement, he took up work in the prison's industrial program, where he was assigned to a company producing industrial coffee machines. Seeking ways to engage himself further, he also participated in various prison activities, including literary and cooking competitions. Whether it was a genuine attempt to find meaning in his incarceration or simply a way to endure the passing years, Bassetti immersed himself in these programs. Yet, despite his efforts to adapt, he never stopped proclaiming his innocence, holding on to the hope that one day he would have another chance to prove it. The case remained a subject of intense debate in Italy. While many believed the forensic evidence was conclusive, others questioned whether the conviction was fair. The lack of a clear motive, the inability to retest the DNA, and the presence of alternative suspects continued to cast doubt in the minds of some. In 2023, Netflix released a documentary titled The Yara Gambirasio Case, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, revisiting the case and raising questions about the trial's fairness. For Yara's family, nothing could undo their pain. They had lost their daughter in the most horrific way, and no legal battle could change that. They had largely stayed out of the public eye, choosing to grieve privately. For them, the court's decision provided some closure. They finally knew who had taken their daughter away. The case also left a lasting impact on Italian law enforcement. It was one of the most extensive forensic investigations in the country's history, demonstrating both the power and the limitations of DNA evidence in criminal cases. More than a decade later, Yara's story remains one of Italy's most well-known true crime cases. She was more than just a victim. She was a bright, ambitious girl with dreams of becoming a gymnastics champion. She deserved to grow up, to live her life. While debates about the case may continue, one thing is certain: Yara Gambirasio's life mattered, and her memory will never be forgotten.